Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey behind the vermilion walls and golden roofs of imperial Chinese palaces, where power, protocol, and palace intrigue created a world more suffocating than any prison. Forget the elegant courtyards and graceful architecture you've seen in movies. Tonight, we're exploring what it was really like to live inside the Forbidden City and other imperial palaces, where every breath you took was monitored, every word you spoke could be your last, and privacy was about as common as an emperor doing his own laundry. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in what amounts to a city within a city, surrounded by walls so high and thick that they might as well be made of impossibility itself. The Forbidden City in Beijing, for instance, covered 180 acres and housed anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 people at any given time. That's roughly the population of a small town, all crammed into a space where your entire existence revolves around the whims of one person, the emperor. Now, you might think living in a palace sounds pretty sweet. Golden roofs, marble pathways, gardens so beautiful they'd make a landscape architect weep with envy. But here's the thing about gilded cages. They're still cages. And in imperial China, the bars were made of tradition, protocol, and the ever-present threat of execution for the smallest transgression. If you were lucky enough to be born into the imperial family, congratulations, you'd just won the lottery for a lifetime of suffocating privilege. Your every move would be choreographed, your every word scripted, and your every relationship calculated for political advantage. Want to take a casual stroll through the gardens? Better hope the court astronomers haven't declared it an inauspicious day for walking. Feel like having a conversation with someone? Make sure they're the appropriate rank, speaking at the correct volume, and addressing you with precisely the right number of honorifics. The emperor himself lived in what was essentially a beautiful isolation chamber. Imagine being so powerful that people literally prostrate themselves when you enter a room, but so lonely that you can't have a genuine conversation with another human being. Every person around you wants something: power, favor, money, or simply to avoid execution. It's like being the world's most successful influencer, except instead of losing followers when you post something controversial, people lose their heads. So you've managed to secure a position in the imperial palace. Congratulations. You're now part of the most elaborate pecking order in human history. Chinese imperial hierarchy was like a ladder, with roughly 30,000 rungs, and falling down even one of them could be fatal. At the top you have the emperor, the son of heaven, the living embodiment of divine will, the person whose morning bowel movements were probably documented by some unfortunate court official. Just below him, the empress and imperial concubines occupied their own intricate ranking system. The empress was theoretically second in command, but even she had to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics, where a misinterpreted glance or an inappropriately timed cough could spell disaster. Then came the princes and princesses, who lived lives of pampered misery. Sure, they wore silk and ate delicacies, but they were also political pawns in a game where the stakes were literally life and death. Brothers plotted against brothers, sisters schemed against sisters, and family dinners were probably more tense than a hostage negotiation. Below the imperial family, you had the various ranks of court officials, from ministers and governors down to the lowly scribes who spent their days copying documents in rooms lit by flickering candles. Each rank had its own uniform, its own living quarters, its own dining arrangements, and its own specific ways of bowing and scraping before their superiors. And then there were the eunuchs. Ah, the eunuchs. Men who had made the ultimate sacrifice for a chance at power and influence. These weren't just palace servants, they were often the real power behind the throne, controlling access to the emperor and manipulating palace politics with the skill of seasoned chess masters. The catch? Well, they'd literally given up their manhood for the privilege. It's like joining an exclusive club where the membership fee is your reproductive organs. At the bottom of this elaborate pyramid were the palace servants, maids and guards, thousands of people whose lives were considered so expendable that they could be executed for crimes as minor as looking directly at the emperor without permission. These folks lived in cramped quarters, ate whatever scraps were left over from the imperial kitchens, and worked from dawn to dusk, maintaining the illusion of paradise for their betters. Now that you're settling into palace life, let's talk about your morning routine. Remember how you used to complain about having to get up early for work? Well, forget everything you know about morning efficiency, because in a Chinese imperial palace, getting the emperor dressed for the day was like performing surgery while conducting an orchestra. The emperor's morning toilet began before dawn, not because he was an early riser, but because it took approximately 17 people and 4 hours to make him presentable to the court. First, there were the eunuchs responsible for testing everything, and I mean everything, for poison. Your toothbrush, which didn't exist, but let's say your mouth-cleaning implements, your face wash, your breakfast, even the silk underwear that touched your imperial skin, all of it had to be tested by someone whose job description literally included die instead of the emperor, if necessary. Then came the dressing ceremony, which was less like putting on clothes and more like being slowly wrapped in layers of symbolic significance. Each garment had meaning, each colour represented something specific, and each accessory had to be placed just so according to traditions that dated back centuries. The emperor's robes were so heavy and elaborate that he probably needed help sitting down. We're talking about silk so fine it costs more per yard than most people made in a year, embroidered with dragons and phoenixes using gold thread that was literally worth its weight in, well, gold. And let's not forget about the hat situation. Imperial headwear was basically architectural engineering disguised as fashion. These weren't just hats, they were elaborate constructions of silk, gold, jade, and precious stones that probably weighed as much as a small child. Wearing one of these things all day must have been like doing a workout while attending a business meeting. But here's the really fun part. Once you were dressed, you couldn't just relax and enjoy your finery. Every time you moved, sat, or even shifted position, there were specific protocols to follow. Sit wrong, and you're disrespecting the ancestors. Walk too fast, and you're showing unseemly haste. Walk too slow, and you're being deliberately inefficient with the court's time. It was like playing a video game where the controls are invisible, and the penalty for mistakes is death. Meanwhile, if you were a concubine preparing for a potential audience with the emperor, your morning routine was equally elaborate, but with the added stress of knowing that your appearance could determine whether you spent the evening in imperial favour or in a dungeon somewhere. Palace beauticians would spend hours applying makeup, arranging hair, and selecting jewellery, all while you sat perfectly still because moving might smudge something and ruin your chances of catching the emperor's eye. The lower-ranking palace inhabitants had their own morning rituals, though considerably less glamorous. Servants woke before dawn to begin their daily tasks, which included everything from cleaning the emperor's chamber pots to preparing the elaborate meals that would feed thousands of people throughout the day. So you've survived the morning routine, and now it's time to eat. Surely, living in a palace means access to the finest cuisine in the empire, right? Well, yes and no. If you're high enough in the hierarchy, mealtimes become elaborate theatrical performances where the food is almost secondary to the symbolism. Imperial dining was less about nutrition and more about demonstrating the cosmic order through carefully arranged dishes. The emperor didn't just eat lunch, he participated in a ritual that reinforced his position as the center of the universe. Every meal involved dozens of dishes, even if he only took a single bite from each one. This wasn't gluttony, this was politics on a platter. The emperor's food taster had perhaps the most stressful job in human history. Imagine knowing that every bite you take could be your last. Not because the food is bad, but because someone might have decided today was a good day to poison the son of heaven. These brave individuals would sample every dish, wait a few minutes to see if they dropped dead, and then give the all clear for the emperor to eat. It was like being a human canary in a coal mine, except the coal mine was made of dumplings, and the canary got paid in the privilege of continuing to exist. For the imperial family and high-ranking officials, meals were served on porcelain so fine and expensive that breaking a plate could cost you a year's salary. The dishes themselves were works of art, elaborate presentations of ingredients that had been transported from across the empire, prepared by master chefs who had trained for decades to achieve the perfect balance of flavors that would please the imperial palate. But here's where it gets interesting. Even with access to the finest ingredients in China, palace dining came with its own special brand of misery. You couldn't just eat when you were hungry. Meals happened at precisely scheduled times, in specific locations, with particular people, following exact protocols. Want a midnight snack? Better hope you're important enough to wake up the kitchen staff, and that someone's willing to test your late-night dumpling for poison. The lower you were in the palace hierarchy, the more your meals resembled what we might recognize as normal food. Though normal is relative when you're living in an artificial city devoted to one person's whims. Palace servants ate communally, in designated areas, consuming simple rice-based meals with whatever vegetables and occasional bits of meat the kitchen staff could spare. It wasn't exactly starvation, but it wasn't the feast you might expect from palace life either. And then there were the eunuchs, who had their own dining arrangements that reflected their unique position in palace society. Neither fully male nor female, neither servant nor noble, they existed in a social limbo that extended even to mealtimes. Some powerful eunuchs dined almost as well as the emperor himself, while others subsisted on little more than rice and pickled vegetables. The most frustrating part about palace dining wasn't the hierarchy or the protocols, it was the waste. Thousands of dishes were prepared daily, most of which were barely touched. The emperor might take a single bite from 50 different plates, leaving the rest to be cleared away. In a country where famines were common and peasants regularly starved, the sheer excess of imperial dining must have been both magnificent and obscene. Now that you've managed to get dressed and fed without causing an international incident, let's talk about the real challenge of palace life: surviving the politics. If you thought your workplace was a snake pit, imagine an environment where office gossip could literally get you executed, and where your co-workers are actively plotting to either use you for their advancement or eliminate you as competition. Palace politics in imperial China were like playing chess, except the board had 1,000 squares. Half the pieces were invisible, and checkmate meant losing your head rather than just your dignity. Every conversation was a potential trap, every friendship a possible betrayal, and every silence an opportunity for someone else to interpret your thoughts in the most unfavorable light possible. The emperor, sitting at the center of this web of intrigue, was both the most powerful person in the room and, paradoxically, often the least informed about what was actually happening in his own palace. Information flowed upward through layers of bureaucracy, with each level adding its own spin, interpretation, or outright fabrication. By the time news reached the imperial ears, it had been filtered, massaged, and shaped by dozens of people, each with their own agenda. This information bottleneck created a fascinating dynamic. The emperor was simultaneously omnipotent and blind, all-knowing and completely clueless. He could order someone's execution with a gesture, but he might not know that his favorite concubine was actually a spy, or that his most trusted advisor was embezzling funds to build a private army. It's like being the CEO of a company where everyone tells you business is great, while the building burns down around you. For everyone else in the palace, survival meant mastering the art of saying nothing, while appearing to say everything. Conversations became elaborate dances of implication and inference, where the real message was hidden between the lines of seemingly innocent small talk. Complimenting someone's robe might actually be a coded insult about their political alliances, while asking about the weather could be a subtle way of probing for information about upcoming court appointments. The concubine system added another layer of complexity to palace politics. These weren't just the emperor's romantic partners, they were players in a high-stakes game where producing a male heir could elevate you to the heights of power, while falling out of favor could result in a lifetime of isolation or worse. Concubines formed alliances, plotted against rivals, and wielded influence through their relationships with the emperor, all while maintaining the fiction that they were simply decorative objects, existing for imperial pleasure. Eunuchs, meanwhile, operated in their own parallel power structure. Because they couldn't have families or dynasties of their own, their loyalty was supposedly unquestionable. In practice, this made them some of the most dangerous political operators in the palace. Without the distraction of wives and children, they could focus entirely on accumulating power and influence, often becoming the real decision-makers behind imperial decrees. The result was an environment where paranoia wasn't just reasonable, it was essential for survival. Everyone was watching everyone else, looking for signs of disloyalty, weakness, or opportunity. The palace was filled with spies, informants, and amateur psychologists, all trying to read the motivations and intentions of their colleagues while hiding their own. Let's address something that the historical documentaries tend to skip over. What happened when you needed to use the bathroom in a Chinese imperial palace? This might seem like a trivial concern, but in a world where everything was regulated by protocol and hierarchy, even basic biological functions became complicated political statements. The emperor's bathroom arrangements were, predictably, elaborate affairs involving multiple attendants, specialized equipment, and probably more ceremony than most people's weddings. Imperial chamber pots were works of art in themselves, porcelain masterpieces decorated with dragons and phoenixes, as if somehow making the receptacle beautiful would transform the act of using it into something dignified. But here's where palace life gets really uncomfortable. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. The emperor couldn't even relieve himself without an audience of eunuchs standing by to assist, observe, and presumably take notes for posterity. Imagine trying to concentrate on your business while knowing that someone is watching your every move and will later file a report about your digestive health with the court physicians. For everyone else in the palace, bathroom breaks were scheduled affairs that had to be approved by supervisors and coordinated with daily duties. You couldn't just excuse yourself whenever nature called. You had to wait for designated bathroom times and use facilities appropriate to your rank. High-ranking officials had access to relatively private facilities, while servants shared communal latrines that offered about as much privacy as a public swimming pool. The palace plumbing system, such as it was, consisted mainly of an elaborate network of drains and channels that carried waste away from the main buildings. This was actually quite advanced for its time, but it also meant that maintaining the system required a dedicated staff of workers whose job was to keep the palace's waste management system functioning smoothly. Talk about a job that really stinks. And then there was the matter of toilet paper, which didn't exist in the form we know it today. Instead, palace inhabitants used silk scraps, specially prepared cloth, or, for the less fortunate, whatever materials were available. The emperor, naturally, used silk so fine and soft that it probably cost more per square than most people's clothing. Meanwhile, servants made do with rougher materials that would make modern toilet paper feel like a luxury spa treatment. The whole bathroom situation was made even more complicated by traditional Chinese medicine's obsession with bodily functions as indicators of health and spiritual well-being. Court physicians regularly examined the emperor's waste products for signs of illness, dietary imbalances, or spiritual disturbances. Your bathroom breaks weren't just biological necessities. They were medical consultations and potential omens for the entire empire. Now that we've covered the daytime miseries of palace life, let's talk about what happened when the sun went down and it was time to sleep. You'd think that in a palace filled with the finest silks and most comfortable furnishings in the empire, getting a good night's rest would be the one luxury everyone could enjoy. You'd be wrong. The emperor's bedtime routine was as elaborate and ritualized as everything else in his life. Going to sleep wasn't just a matter of getting tired and lying down. It was a carefully choreographed ceremony involving multiple attendants, specific protocols, and probably more stress than most people experience during their waking hours. First, there was the matter of choosing which bedroom to use. The emperor didn't just have one bedroom, he had multiple sleeping chambers throughout the palace, and the choice of which one to use on any given night was both a strategic decision and a security measure. Sleeping in the same room every night would make it too easy for potential assassins to predict his location, so the imperial sleep schedule was kept secret and changed regularly. Once the bedroom was selected, the preparation began. Eunuchs would inspect every inch of the room for potential threats, test the bedding for poison, and check for hidden weapons or intruders. The bed itself was a masterpiece of luxury. Silk sheets so fine they felt like liquid, pillows stuffed with the softest materials available, and coverlets embroidered with protective symbols and auspicious imagery. But here's the catch. Even in sleep, the emperor couldn't escape the demands of his position. Attendants remained in the room throughout the night, ready to respond to imperial needs or protect against threats. Imagine trying to get comfortable and drift off to sleep while knowing that several people are watching your every movement, listening to your breathing, and taking mental notes about your sleep patterns. For concubines, bedtime could be either a moment of anticipated glory or crushing disappointment, depending on whether they'd been selected for imperial attention. Those chosen for the night would undergo their own elaborate preparation rituals, involving special baths, carefully selected sleepwear, and briefings on proper behavior in the imperial presence. The pressure to perform perfectly was enormous. A single mistake could mean banishment from imperial favor forever. The concubines not selected for imperial attention faced a different kind of bedtime misery. The loneliness and frustration of knowing that their entire future depended on the whims of one man who might not even remember their names. They'd lie in their own quarters, staring at silk-covered ceilings and wondering if they'd ever get another chance to advance their position in the palace hierarchy. Palace servants and lower-ranking officials faced more practical sleeping challenges. Their quarters were cramped, often shared with multiple roommates, and located in the least desirable parts of the palace complex. While the imperial family slept on silk and down, servants made do with basic bedding and rooms that were cold in winter and stifling in summer. The most bizarre aspect of palace sleeping arrangements was probably the security protocols. Guards patrolled the corridors throughout the night. Eunuchs monitored the imperial quarters, and various other officials maintained watch over different sections of the palace. It was like trying to sleep in a city that never truly rested, where the sounds of footsteps, whispered conversations, and opening doors provided a constant soundtrack to your attempts at rest. Let's talk about what happened when you got sick in a Chinese imperial palace. In a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, or basic understanding of germ theory, illness was always a serious matter. But in the palace, being sick wasn't just about your personal health. It was a political and social crisis that could affect your entire family's future. If you were the emperor and you felt unwell, congratulations, you just triggered a palace-wide emergency. Imperial illness was considered a sign of cosmic imbalance, suggesting that something was wrong with the emperor's relationship to heaven and earth. Court physicians would descend upon you like a flock of very serious, very worried birds, each offering their own interpretation of your symptoms and their own recommendations for treatment. Traditional Chinese medicine in the imperial court was a complex system based on balancing the body's vital energies, adjusting the flow of qi, and maintaining harmony between the 5 elements. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, the treatments could be quite interesting. Feeling tired? Time for some bloodletting with carefully positioned leeches. Digestive problems? Here's a cocktail of ground pearls, powdered rhinoceros horn, and herbs that taste like punishment itself. The pressure on imperial physicians was enormous. Successfully treating the emperor could bring wealth, status, and imperial favor. Failing to cure an imperial illness, on the other hand, could result in execution for incompetence, demotion to treating palace servants, or banishment from the palace entirely. It's like being a doctor where malpractice suits are handled by the executioner's axe rather than insurance companies. For imperial family members and high-ranking officials, illness brought its own special challenges. You'd receive the attention of skilled physicians and have access to expensive medicines, but you'd also become the center of unwanted political attention. Other court members would be watching to see if your illness might create opportunities for advancement, while rivals might wonder if your condition could be used to their advantage. Palace servants and lower-ranking inhabitants faced a different kind of medical care entirely. When they got sick, treatment was basic at best, and often consisted of folk remedies, herbal teas, and the hope that whatever was wrong would resolve itself. The palace employed some physicians specifically for treating servants, but these doctors were often the ones who weren't skilled enough to treat their social betters. The most interesting aspect of palace healthcare was probably the food as medicine approach. Imperial meals weren't just about taste and nutrition. They were carefully planned therapeutic interventions designed to maintain the emperor's health and spiritual balance. Different ingredients were believed to affect different organs and energy systems, so the imperial kitchen was essentially a pharmacy disguised as a restaurant. Pregnancy in the palace was particularly fraught with medical and political implications. If you were an imperial concubine who managed to become pregnant, you'd receive the finest medical care available, but you'd also become the focus of intense scrutiny and potential jealousy from other concubines. Palace physicians would monitor your every symptom, adjust your diet and activities, and probably stress you out more than the pregnancy itself. The herbal medicine storage areas in imperial palaces were like ancient pharmacies, filled with thousands of different substances, each with its own specific properties and uses. Ginseng from Korea, various fungi from mountain forests, minerals ground into powders, and animal parts that would make modern wildlife protection agencies very upset. The preparation of these medicines was an art form in itself, requiring precise timing, specific tools, and extensive knowledge of how different substances interacted with each other. After surviving another day of palace politics, elaborate meals, and potential poisoning, you might think it's time to relax and enjoy some entertainment. Well, you'd be half right. There was certainly entertainment in Chinese imperial palaces, but relaxation was relative, when every performance was a potential political statement, and every entertainer was a possible spy. Imperial entertainment wasn't just about having a good time, it was about demonstrating the emperor's cultural refinement, maintaining court morale, and providing venues for political networking. Opera performances, musical concerts, poetry readings, and elaborate theatrical productions were regular features of palace life. But attending these events was less like going to a concert and more like participating in a diplomatic summit with costumes. The emperor's box at theatrical performances was positioned to give him the best view, but it also meant that he was on display for everyone else in attendance. Every reaction, every expression of approval or disapproval was noted and analysed by courtiers looking for clues about imperial preferences and political leanings. Applauding at the wrong moment could suggest poor taste, while failing to show sufficient enthusiasm might indicate disloyalty to the cultural values the performance represented. Palace musicians and performers lived in their own peculiar category of the social hierarchy. They were artists, but they were also servants, whose livelihood depended on pleasing imperial tastes. A successful performance could bring rewards and recognition, while a poor showing might result in demotion, punishment, or exile from the palace. Imagine being a concert pianist where hitting a wrong note could get you banished to the provinces. The most elaborate entertainments were the seasonal festivals and celebrations that marked important dates in the imperial calendar. These weren't just parties, they were massive productions involving hundreds of performers, elaborate costumes, specially composed music, and choreographed spectacles that could take months to plan and prepare. The spring festival celebration, for instance, might involve dragon dances, fireworks displays, acrobatic performances, and theatrical presentations that went on for days. But here's the thing about mandatory fun. It stops being fun pretty quickly. Palace inhabitants were expected to attend these entertainments, to show appropriate enthusiasm, and to participate in the collective celebration of imperial magnificence. Missing an important performance without a very good excuse was considered disrespectful, while attending but showing insufficient enthusiasm was almost as bad. For the performers themselves, palace entertainments were high-pressure situations where careers could be made or destroyed in a single evening. Court musicians spent years perfecting their craft, not just to create beautiful music, but to avoid the career-ending mistake of playing something that might be interpreted as politically subversive or culturally inappropriate. The palace also maintained troops of acrobats, dancers, and specialty performers who provided entertainment during banquets and special occasions. These individuals lived in the palace complex but occupied a social position somewhere between servant and artist. They were valued for their skills but never allowed to forget their place in the hierarchy. Perhaps the most stressful form of palace entertainment was the imperial poetry contest, where courtiers were expected to compose verses on assigned themes within strict time limits. These weren't just literary exercises, they were tests of cultural knowledge, political loyalty, and intellectual capability. A clever poem could enhance your reputation and career prospects, while a poorly constructed verse, or one with unfortunate implications, could damage your standing at court. Let's talk about fashion in the imperial palace, where clothing wasn't just about looking good or staying warm. It was a complex system of visual communication that could convey social status, political allegiances, and personal character with a single glance. In a world without name tags or business cards, your outfit was your resume, your political platform, and your social security card, all rolled into one very expensive silk package. The emperor's wardrobe was less a collection of clothes and more a museum of symbolic power. Different robes for different occasions, each with specific colours, patterns, and decorative elements that communicated particular messages about imperial authority and cosmic harmony. The famous dragon robe wasn't just a fancy outfit, it was a visual representation of the emperor's role as the earthly embodiment of celestial power, complete with dragons that had the correct number of claws. 5. In case you were wondering, 4-clawed dragons were for lesser mortals. But here's where palace fashion gets really stressful. The rules weren't just suggestions, they were laws enforced by death. Wearing the wrong colour, using inappropriate decorative motifs, or displaying the incorrect number of ornamental elements could be interpreted as anything from ignorance to treason. It's like having a dress code where violations are handled by the executioner, rather than human resources. For members of the imperial court, getting dressed each morning was like taking a final exam in visual semiotics. Your hat indicated your rank, your belt buckle showed your specific position within that rank, and your shoes revealed your current political status. The colour of your robe communicated your relationship to the emperor, while the patterns embroidered on your sleeves indicated your family background and career achievements. Imperial concubines faced their own fashion challenges, with wardrobe choices that could literally determine their fate. The right outfit might catch the emperor's eye and elevate their status, while the wrong ensemble could consign them to obscurity, or worse. Palace fashion advisors would spend hours helping concubines select clothing that struck the perfect balance between attractive and appropriate, eye-catching and respectful. The seasonal wardrobe changes in imperial palaces were major logistical operations involving hundreds of servants, countless hours of preparation, and storage systems that would make modern fashion houses weep with envy. Different seasons required completely different wardrobes, not just for practical reasons, but because certain colours and fabrics were associated with specific times of year and cosmic forces. Jewellery in the imperial palace wasn't just decorative, it was functional communication technology. Different gems indicated different ranks and positions, while the arrangement of ornamental elements could convey complex messages about political alliances and social relationships. A strategically placed jade ornament might signal support for a particular policy, while the absence of a traditional accessory could indicate disapproval or dissent. The most anxiety-inducing aspect of palace fashion was probably the constant scrutiny from other court members, all of whom were experts in reading the social and political messages embedded in clothing choices. Every public appearance was like walking a fashion runway, where the judges were looking for reasons to criticize rather than praise, and where a single misstep could damage your reputation permanently. Palace servants had their own fashion challenges, though considerably less deadly ones. Their clothing indicated their specific roles and ranks within the servant hierarchy, and maintaining clean, appropriate attire was essential for avoiding punishment or demotion. Even servants' clothing was regulated by detailed rules about colours, fabrics, and decorative elements. The silk production system that supported imperial fashion was an industry unto itself, involving thousands of workers, elaborate trade networks, and closely guarded secrets about dye formulas and weaving techniques. The finest silk reserved for imperial use was so expensive and labour-intensive to produce that a single robe might represent years of work by dozens of artisans. Now that you've navigated the treacherous waters of palace fashion, let's discuss one of the most paranoia-inducing aspects of imperial Chinese palace life: the comprehensive surveillance system that made modern intelligence agencies look like amateur hour. In the imperial palace, privacy wasn't just rare, it was essentially non-existent, and everyone from the highest-ranking minister to the lowest kitchen servant was both a potential spy and a potential target of espionage. The emperor, despite being the most powerful person in the empire, was also the most watched. Eunuchs assigned to monitor his daily activities kept detailed records of everything from his eating habits to his sleeping patterns, his conversations to his bathroom visits. These weren't just servants attending to imperial needs, they were intelligence agents whose reports could influence policy decisions and political appointments. But the emperor wasn't the only one under surveillance. The imperial concubines were monitored constantly, not just for security reasons, but to track their influence over the emperor and their potential involvement in palace politics. Every conversation was noted, every visitor recorded, and every change in behaviour analysed for its potential political implications. Court officials lived in a world where their colleagues were simultaneously their allies and their potential betrayers. Friendships were strategic arrangements that could be dissolved at a moment's notice, while enemies might be forced to work together on imperial projects despite their mutual hatred. The result was an environment where genuine trust was almost impossible, and paranoia was a survival skill, rather than a mental illness. The eunuch spy network was particularly sophisticated, operating multiple layers of surveillance that would make modern intelligence services envious. Senior eunuchs maintained their own networks of informants, while lower-ranking eunuchs served as the eyes and ears of their superiors. Information flowed upward through these networks, creating comprehensive intelligence reports about palace activities and potential threats. Palace servants existed in their own surveillance ecosystem, where reporting on their superiors or colleagues could provide opportunities for advancement, while being reported on could result in punishment or worse. The kitchen staff monitored each other for signs of disloyalty or potential poisoning attempts, while cleaning servants were expected to report any suspicious activities they observed while performing their duties. The most insidious aspect of the palace spy network was how it poisoned all human relationships. Genuine friendship became nearly impossible when every conversation might be reported to hostile parties, and family relationships within the palace were strained by competing loyalties and the constant pressure to choose between personal bonds and political survival. Information was the currency of palace politics, and those who controlled the flow of intelligence wielded enormous power despite their nominal positions in the hierarchy. A well-placed eunuch with access to sensitive information could influence policy decisions and personnel appointments, while courtiers who failed to maintain their own intelligence networks found themselves outmaneuvered by better-informed rivals. The palace communication system relied heavily on coded messages, subtle signals, and indirect communication methods that allowed people to share information while maintaining plausible deniability. A strategically placed ornament might indicate a message, while the choice of tea served at a meeting could convey political positions or warnings about potential threats. Let's examine the economic engine that powered these elaborate palaces, because behind all the silk robes and golden decorations was a financial system that would make modern tax accountants break out in cold sweats. Running an imperial palace wasn't just expensive, it was economically devastating for the empire as a whole, consuming resources that could have fed entire provinces while supporting a lifestyle of almost incomprehensible luxury. The daily operating costs of a major imperial palace were staggering. Thousands of people needed to be fed, clothed, and housed, while the palace itself required constant maintenance, decoration, and security. The silk alone for imperial robes could cost more than most people would see in their lifetimes, while a single imperial banquet might consume resources equivalent to feeding a small city for months. Palace servants, despite living in luxury compared to most of the empire's population, were essentially economic slaves, whose labour supported the imperial lifestyle. They worked without wages in the traditional sense, receiving food, housing, and clothing in exchange for their service, but never accumulating personal wealth or economic independence. It was like working for a company where your salary is room and board, and your retirement plan is hoping someone doesn't decide to execute you. The tribute system that funded imperial palaces was a massive economic drain on the provinces, with local governors required to send specific quantities of goods, materials, and money to support the imperial lifestyle. Rice from the south, silk from specialized regions, tea from mountain areas, and manufactured goods from craftsmen across the empire, all flowing toward the palace to sustain an artificial world of abundance in the middle of an often struggling economy. Imperial construction projects were economic disasters disguised as architectural achievements. Building a new palace or significantly renovating an existing one could bankrupt entire regions, with massive labor requirements, expensive materials, and complex logistics that disrupted normal economic activity for years. The famous Forbidden City took over 1 million workers more than a decade to complete, consuming resources that could have built hundreds of normal cities. The economic inequality within the palace itself was breathtaking. While the emperor dined on delicacies that cost more than most people's annual income, palace servants subsisted on basic rice and vegetables. A single piece of imperial jewelry might represent more wealth than an entire village would see in generations, while the people who cleaned the rooms containing that jewelry lived in quarters that were barely better than poverty. For those trapped in the palace economic system, there was no real path to financial independence or economic mobility. Your position determined your lifestyle, and your lifestyle was entirely dependent on continuing to please your superiors. It was like being stuck in a job where your salary is entirely based on your boss's mood, and your boss has the power to have you executed for poor performance. The corruption inherent in such a system was inevitable and pervasive. Eunuchs and court officials who controlled access to imperial resources could accumulate enormous personal wealth through kickbacks, bribes, and embezzlement, while palace servants who handled valuable goods faced constant temptation and constant surveillance to prevent theft. So you've survived the economic pressures of palace life, and now it's time to discuss your spiritual obligations. In imperial China, religion wasn't just a personal matter, it was a political and social requirement that consumed enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources while providing very little in the way of actual spiritual comfort. The emperor's role as the son of heaven meant that his spiritual activities were matters of state importance. Every prayer, every ritual, every religious ceremony was performed not just for personal salvation, but to maintain the cosmic balance that kept the empire functioning. If the emperor failed in his religious duties, the consequences weren't just personal. They could include natural disasters, military defeats, and economic collapse for the entire empire. Imperial religious ceremonies were elaborate affairs that required months of preparation and involved hundreds of participants. The emperor couldn't just show up and pray. He had to perform specific rituals in precisely the correct manner, wearing appropriate ceremonial robes, and following scripts that had been developed over centuries. It was like being the lead actor in a play, where forgetting your lines could cause earthquakes. Palace temples and shrines required constant maintenance and attention from dedicated religious staff who performed daily rituals, maintained sacred objects, and prepared for the major ceremonial events that punctuated the imperial calendar. These weren't just spiritual centers, they were political institutions where religious activities served diplomatic and administrative functions, as well as spiritual ones. For palace inhabitants below the imperial level, religious observance was both an obligation and an opportunity. Participating in religious ceremonies demonstrated loyalty and cultural refinement, while failing to show proper reverence could be interpreted as disloyalty or barbarism. It was like attending church where your devotion is being graded and poor performance affects your career prospects. The religious dietary restrictions and seasonal observances that governed palace life added another layer of complexity to daily routines. Certain times of year required fasting or specific foods, while particular ceremonies demanded ritual purification and preparation that could take days. Your spiritual calendar was as crowded and demanding as your political and social obligations. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all played roles in imperial palace religious life, often simultaneously and sometimes contradictorily. Navigating the different requirements and expectations of these various spiritual traditions required extensive knowledge and careful attention to current imperial preferences, which could change based on political considerations or personal imperial experiences. The most stressful aspect of palace religious life was probably the way spiritual activities were intertwined with political loyalty. Participating in certain ceremonies or showing devotion to particular deities could be interpreted as political statements, while religious discussions among palace inhabitants were monitored for signs of subversive thinking or disloyalty to imperial authority. Let's talk about education in the imperial palace, where knowledge was both the path to power and the road to destruction. In a world where literacy was rare and specialized knowledge was jealously guarded, the palace educational system was designed to create loyal, capable servants of the imperial system, while ensuring that no one became educated enough to pose a threat to imperial authority. Imperial princes received the finest education available in the empire, with personal tutors, access to extensive libraries, and instruction in everything from classical literature to military strategy. But this educational privilege came with enormous pressure. Their performance wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about demonstrating their fitness for potential imperial succession or high-ranking positions in the government. The imperial examination system that selected government officials was theoretically based on merit and educational achievement, but in practice, it was influenced by family connections, political considerations, and the ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of palace life. Studying for these examinations required years of intensive preparation, memorizing vast amounts of classical literature, and learning to write in the highly stylized formats that demonstrated cultural refinement. Palace tutors and educational staff occupied a precarious position in the imperial hierarchy. They were respected for their knowledge and cultural accomplishments, But they were also servants whose continued employment depended on their ability to educate their students without teaching them anything that might be considered subversive or inappropriate. It was like being a teacher, where your curriculum is determined by people who might execute you for teaching critical thinking. For the children of palace servants and lower-ranking officials, educational opportunities were limited, but still essential for advancement within the palace system. Basic literacy and numeracy skills were necessary for most administrative positions, while specialized knowledge of palace protocols and procedures could open doors to better positions and higher status. The palace libraries were treasure troves of knowledge that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom, but access was strictly controlled based on rank and position. Certain books were considered too dangerous for general circulation, while others required special permission to read. It was like having the world's greatest library, where most of the books are locked away and reading the wrong one could get you banished. Female education in the palace was particularly complex, with different expectations and opportunities depending on social position. Imperial princesses received extensive education in literature, arts, and palace management, while concubines were educated in subjects designed to make them more attractive and useful to the emperor. Palace servants' daughters might receive basic education if they showed promise for advancement, but their learning was always subordinated to their expected roles as wives and mothers. The philosophical and ethical education that was central to Chinese scholarly tradition became politically fraught in the palace environment. Confucian ideals about virtue and good governance could conflict with the realities of imperial autocracy, while Taoist concepts about simplicity and natural harmony were difficult to reconcile with the artificial luxury of palace life. Now that you've survived the educational gauntlet, let's discuss marriage and relationships in the imperial palace, where romance was about as genuine as a $3 bill, and every potential partner came with a complete set of political implications and family obligations. Imperial marriages were state affairs that could influence diplomatic relationships, economic policies, and military alliances. The emperor's choice of empress wasn't just about personal compatibility, it was a political decision that could affect the balance of power among noble families and determine the future direction of imperial policy. Romance was nice if it happened, but it was definitely not a requirement for imperial matrimony. For imperial princes and princesses, marriage choices were made by committee, with input from family members, court advisors, and political allies, who all had their own agendas and preferences. Personal feelings were considered secondary to political advantages, economic benefits, and the need to maintain or improve the family's position in the imperial hierarchy. The concubine system added another layer of complexity to imperial relationships. These weren't just romantic arrangements, they were political alliances disguised as personal relationships. Families would compete to have their daughters selected as imperial concubines, not because they wanted their children to find love, but because concubinage could provide access to imperial favor and political influence. Palace eunuchs, unable to marry or have families in the traditional sense, formed their own relationship networks based on professional alliances, shared interests, and mutual protection. These relationships could be just as intense and complicated as traditional marriages, with all the emotional drama and political implications that came with any close personal bond in the palace environment. For palace servants, marriage was often a practical arrangement that had to be approved by supervisors and coordinated with work schedules and living arrangements. Servant marriages were typically between people of similar rank and position, creating small family units within the larger palace community that provided emotional support and practical assistance in navigating palace life. The most tragic aspect of palace relationships was probably the way political considerations poisoned genuine emotional connections. People who might have been friends or lovers in different circumstances were forced to view each other as potential threats or opportunities, while family relationships were strained by competing loyalties and the constant pressure to choose between personal bonds and political survival. Imperial divorces were rare, but not unknown, and they were always political events that could have far-reaching consequences for the families involved. A divorced imperial spouse might retain some status and position, or they might be completely ostracized and banished from the palace, depending on the circumstances of the separation and the political climate at the time. Living in an imperial palace meant that even the changing seasons became political and social events that required careful navigation and extensive preparation. The imperial calendar wasn't just about keeping track of dates. It was a complex system of ceremonial obligations, dietary restrictions, clothing requirements, and behavioral expectations that governed every aspect of palace life throughout the year. Spring in the palace brought renewal ceremonies, agricultural festivals, and celebrations of imperial power that required weeks of preparation and coordination. But it also brought seasonal clothing changes that involved entire wardrobes being swapped out, dietary adjustments to maintain cosmic harmony, and increased social activities that created new opportunities for both advancement and political disaster. The summer months brought their own challenges, with intense heat that made the elaborate imperial robes almost unbearable and increased the risk of food spoilage that could lead to poisoning scares or actual foodborne illnesses. Palace life in summer was like attending a formal event in an oven while wearing multiple layers of silk and worrying that your lunch might kill you. Autumn was harvest time, which meant tribute deliveries from across the empire and massive logistical operations to process, store, and distribute the goods that would sustain the palace through winter. It was also the season for major court appointments and policy announcements, making autumn a time of increased political activity and heightened stress for anyone whose career prospects were uncertain. Winter brought isolation and introspection, but also increased fuel costs for heating the massive palace complexes, and greater challenges in maintaining food supplies and managing the health of thousands of palace inhabitants in close quarters. Winter illnesses could spread rapidly through the palace population, creating health crises that had political as well as medical implications. The lunar calendar that governed Chinese seasonal observances added another layer of complexity to palace scheduling, with important festivals and ceremonies that occurred on different dates each year and required constant adjustment of plans and preparations. It was like trying to plan a social calendar where half the important dates keep moving around. Weather patterns weren't just environmental factors, they were interpreted as cosmic signs that reflected the emperor's spiritual condition and the empire's political health. Droughts, floods, unusual storms, or other weather anomalies could be seen as evidence of imperial failure or divine displeasure, creating political pressure to address whatever cosmic imbalance was causing the meteorological problems. Finally, let's discuss the ultimate reality of palace life, death, which in the imperial Chinese court was never just a personal tragedy, but always a political event with far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. In a world where your life expectancy was largely determined by your ability to navigate politics and avoid making fatal mistakes, death was both a constant threat and an ever-present consideration in daily decision-making. Imperial deaths were massive state affairs that required months of preparation, elaborate ceremonies, and careful management of succession politics that could determine the future of the empire. The emperor's death wasn't just the end of a life. It was a constitutional crisis that needed to be managed with precision and speed to prevent civil war and political chaos. For everyone else in the palace, imperial deaths represented both opportunities and threats. New emperors meant new policies, new advisors, and new chances for advancement, but they also meant that existing relationships and alliances might become worthless overnight. It was like working for a company where the CEO's death means everyone might get promoted or everyone might get fired, depending on factors largely beyond their control. The elaborate mourning protocols that governed palace behavior during periods of official grief were almost as complex as the ceremonial requirements for living emperors. Different ranks and positions had different mourning obligations, with specific clothing requirements, behavioral restrictions, and ceremonial duties that could last for years after the initial death. Palace executions were relatively common events that served both practical and symbolic functions. Executing someone for treason, corruption, or incompetence wasn't just about punishment, it was about demonstrating imperial power and deterring others from similar behaviors. Working in an environment where capital punishment was a standard human resources practice created a level of job stress that would make modern workplace anxiety look like a mild case of the jitters. The medical care available to palace inhabitants varied dramatically based on their position and importance, but even the best imperial physicians were working with limited knowledge and primitive tools. Palace deaths from disease, accident, or medical mishaps were common enough that most people had contingency plans for their own demise, and realistic expectations about their life expectancy. Suicide in the palace was sometimes considered an honourable response to political failure or personal disgrace. But it was also sometimes the only way to protect family members from punishment for your mistakes. The decision to end your own life wasn't just personal, it was a political statement that could affect your relatives' future prospects and your family's reputation for generations. The palace burial protocols and ancestral worship requirements meant that death didn't necessarily end your involvement in palace politics. Dead emperors and important court figures continued to influence palace life through ceremonial obligations, policy precedents, and the ongoing political importance of their descendants and former allies. As we reach the end of our journey through the imperial Chinese palace system, it's worth reflecting on what this tells us about power, luxury, and the human condition. These palaces were simultaneously the most beautiful and most oppressive environments in human history. Places where unimaginable wealth and artistic achievement coexisted with psychological torture and systematic dehumanization. The people who lived in these palaces had access to luxuries that most of us can barely imagine. Silk so fine it felt like liquid, food prepared by master chefs, and artistic performances that represented centuries of cultural refinement. But they paid for these privileges with their freedom, their privacy, their authentic relationships, and often their lives. The emperor himself, despite being the most powerful person in the world, was perhaps the most trapped of all. Surrounded by people who wanted to use him, isolated from genuine human connection, and burdened with responsibilities that affected millions of lives, the imperial position was less a privilege than a form of elaborate punishment disguised as honor. The palace servants, eunuchs, concubines, and court officials, who made up the bulk of the palace population, lived in a world where survival required constant vigilance, perfect performance, and the ability to navigate political complexities that would challenge modern diplomats. They were neither slaves nor free people, but something in between, human beings whose lives were defined by their service to an institution that consumed their individuality in exchange for material security. The legacy of these palace systems extends far beyond their historical period, influencing Chinese culture, politics, and social relationships for centuries. The emphasis on hierarchy, the importance of face and reputation, the complex relationship between public and private identity, all of these elements of traditional Chinese society were shaped by the palace experience and continue to influence Chinese culture today. Perhaps most importantly, the imperial palace system demonstrates the ultimate futility of seeking happiness through the accumulation of power and luxury. Despite having access to everything money could buy and control over millions of lives, the people who lived in these palaces were often profoundly unhappy, constantly anxious, and spiritually empty. Their beautiful prisons remind us that freedom, authenticity, and genuine human connection are more valuable than all the silk and gold in the world. As you drift off to sleep tonight, in your own private space where you can think your own thoughts and make your own choices without fear of political consequences, take a moment to appreciate the simple freedom of being able to live an ordinary life. The magnificent palaces of imperial China may have been architectural marvels, but they were also monuments to the human capacity for creating beautiful systems of oppression. But before we close our journey through these golden prisons, let's talk about what it was like to be a child in an imperial palace. Because if adult palace life was a complex web of politics and protocol, childhood in the palace was like being enrolled in the world's most expensive and dangerous boarding school from the moment you could walk. Imperial children didn't get to have normal childhoods. From birth, they were treated less like children and more like tiny political assets, whose every developmental milestone had implications for dynastic succession and court politics. An imperial prince learning to walk wasn't just a proud parenting moment. It was a state event that required documentation, analysis, and probably consultation with court astrologers about its cosmic significance. The nurseries in imperial palaces were staffed by teams of carefully selected wet nurses, nannies, and tutors who were responsible not just for the children's physical care, but for their political education and cultural development. These weren't just childcare workers. They were essentially the child's first political advisors, teaching them the complex social hierarchies and behavioral expectations that would govern their entire lives. Playtime for imperial children was educational and supervised. with toys and games specifically designed to reinforce lessons about hierarchy, protocol, and imperial values. A simple game of blocks might include lessons about architectural principles and dynastic symbolism, while playing with miniature soldiers could serve as early military strategy instruction. It was like having a childhood where every toy came with a curriculum and every game had learning objectives. The pressure on imperial children to perform perfectly was enormous, even by palace standards. Their behavior reflected on their parents, their tutors, and the imperial family as a whole, so every public appearance was a test of their training and development. A tantrum or moment of inappropriate behavior wasn't just embarrassing, it could be interpreted as evidence of poor breeding, inadequate education, or worse, spiritual imbalance. For the children of palace servants and lower-ranking officials, growing up in the palace meant learning to navigate complex social situations that most adults would find challenging. They had to understand not just how to behave around children of their own rank, but how to interact appropriately with children from higher and lower social positions, all while maintaining the delicate balance between friendliness and respect. The educational expectations for palace children were intense beyond anything modern parents would recognize. By age 5, imperial children were expected to demonstrate basic literacy, knowledge of classical texts, and understanding of court protocol. By age 10, they needed to be conversant in history, philosophy, poetry, and the political dynamics of court life. It was like having a childhood where every day included final exams. Perhaps most tragically, palace children often had limited contact with their actual parents, who were too busy with their own political and ceremonial obligations to spend time on childcare. Imperial children might see their parents primarily during formal occasions and ceremonial events, creating family relationships that were more like diplomatic alliances than emotional bonds. The health and medical care of palace children was both the best available and extraordinarily stressful. Palace physicians monitored every aspect of a child's development, from their physical growth to their intellectual progress, looking for signs of future problems or evidence of exceptional capabilities. It was like having pediatric care, where your doctor is also evaluating your potential as a future emperor. Let's delve deeper into the elaborate festival system that punctuated palace life throughout the year. Because if you thought the daily routines were exhausting, wait until you hear about the mandatory fun that accompanied every significant date on the imperial calendar. The Spring Festival, which marked the beginning of the new year, was a weeks-long celebration that required months of preparation and involved virtually everyone in the palace. This wasn't just a party, it was a comprehensive renewal ceremony designed to reset the cosmic balance and demonstrate imperial power to both palace inhabitants and visiting dignitaries. The preparation alone was like planning a wedding, a political convention, and a military operation, all at the same time. The festival preparations began months in advance, with specialized teams responsible for different aspects of the celebration. There were teams for decorations, teams for food preparation, teams for entertainment planning, and teams for coordinating the complex logistics of housing and feeding the additional visitors who would arrive for the festivities. Everyone in the palace had specific responsibilities, from the highest-ranking officials down to the servants who would clean up after each day's events. The Dragon Boat Festival brought its own unique challenges, with elaborate boat races staged on palace lakes and waterways. These weren't just sporting events, they were carefully choreographed demonstrations of imperial magnificence that required precise timing, specialized equipment, and participants who had trained for months to perform their roles perfectly. It was like staging an Olympic event, where the stakes were political rather than athletic. The Mid-Autumn Festival focused on family harmony and cosmic balance, which in the palace context meant elaborate ceremonies designed to demonstrate the emperor's role as the father of the nation. These celebrations included special foods, specific decorations, and carefully planned activities that reinforced imperial authority while providing opportunities for political networking and alliance building among court members. The winter solstice celebrations were perhaps the most demanding of all, requiring precise astronomical calculations, elaborate ritual preparations, and ceremonies that could last for days. The emperor's role in these celebrations was both symbolic and practical. He had to perform specific rituals at exact times to maintain cosmic harmony while also hosting diplomatic events that affected international relationships. But here's the exhausting part about palace festivals. They weren't optional. Everyone in the palace was expected to participate enthusiastically, regardless of their personal feelings, health status, or other obligations. Missing a festival event without an excellent excuse was considered disrespectful, while participating without sufficient enthusiasm was almost as bad as not showing up at all. The festival food preparation was a logistical nightmare that would challenge modern event planners. Thousands of people needed to be fed special ceremonial meals that met specific dietary requirements, seasonal appropriateness, and symbolic significance. The palace kitchens worked around the clock during festival periods, preparing dishes that were as much art projects as they were food. Festival entertainment included elaborate performances that combined music, dance, theatre, and acrobatics in productions that could rival modern Broadway shows. But these weren't just entertainment. They were political statements that conveyed messages about imperial power, cultural values, and dynastic legitimacy. Every performance was analysed for its political implications and cultural appropriateness. The clean-up after major festivals was almost as exhausting as the celebrations themselves, with specialised teams responsible for dismantling decorations, cleaning facilities, and returning the palace to its normal operational status. It was like being perpetually involved in the setup and breakdown of major events, with barely enough time to recover from one festival before beginning preparations for the next. Let's explore further the fascinating and terrifying world of Imperial Chinese Palace medicine, where your health wasn't just a personal matter, but a potential state crisis that could trigger everything from policy changes to military campaigns. The palace medical system operated on the principle that the emperor's health reflected the spiritual and political condition of the entire empire. An imperial headache wasn't just discomfort. It was a cosmic warning sign that required immediate analysis by teams of physicians, astrologers, and political advisors. Your sniffles could literally cause a government crisis if they occurred at the wrong time or were interpreted as evidence of spiritual imbalance. Palace physicians were part doctor, part detective, and part political advisor, responsible for diagnosing not just medical conditions, but their potential political implications. They had to understand not only traditional Chinese medicine, but also court politics, dynastic history, and the complex relationships between physical health and imperial authority. It was like being a doctor, where your patient's blood pressure could affect international trade agreements. The diagnostic methods used in palace medicine were elaborate affairs that combined physical examination with astrological analysis, dietary assessment, and political evaluation. A typical imperial medical consultation might involve checking pulse patterns, analysing urine colour, examining tongue condition, consulting star charts, reviewing recent meals, and discussing current political stresses. It was like getting a medical checkup that included a psychological evaluation and a political briefing. Traditional Chinese medicine's emphasis on prevention meant that palace physicians spent more time trying to maintain health than treating illness. Imperial diets were carefully planned therapeutic interventions. Exercise routines were prescribed for specific health benefits, and daily schedules were adjusted to maintain optimal qi flow and cosmic harmony. It was like having a lifestyle where every meal was prescribed by a doctor and every activity was a medical treatment. The palace pharmacies were extraordinary institutions that housed thousands of different medicinal substances from across the empire and beyond. Rare herbs from Tibet, exotic animal parts from Southeast Asia, minerals from remote mountains, and carefully aged ingredients that might have been stored for decades, all organized in complex systems that required specialized knowledge to navigate effectively. The preparation of imperial medicines was an art form that combined chemistry, cooking, and ritual practice. Many medicines required specific preparation methods, precise timing, and carefully controlled conditions to achieve their intended effects. Some treatments took days or weeks to prepare properly, involving multiple steps and specialized equipment that made modern pharmaceutical manufacturing look simple by comparison. The most stressful aspect of palace medicine was probably the political pressure on physicians to provide successful treatments. Failing to cure an imperial illness could result in execution, exile, or professional disgrace, while successful treatments could bring enormous rewards and career advancement. It was like practicing medicine, where malpractice suits were handled by the executioner rather than lawyers. Palace medical records were detailed documents that tracked not just health information, but political implications and astrological correlations. These records were analysed for patterns that might predict future health problems or reveal connections between physical conditions and political events. Your medical history wasn't just personal information, it was a state document that could influence policy decisions. Now let's examine the complex communication systems that kept imperial palaces functioning. Because in a world without telephones, internet, or even reliable postal service, maintaining coordination among thousands of people spread across massive palace complexes required ingenious solutions and created unique opportunities for both efficiency and catastrophic miscommunication. The palace message system relied on networks of runners, mounted messengers, and signal systems that could transmit information across the palace complex in minutes rather than hours. But these weren't just practical communication tools, they were political instruments that could influence power relationships and determine the success or failure of court intrigues. Imperial messages were typically written in specific formats that indicated their urgency, origin, and intended recipients through elaborate systems of seals, colours, and decorative elements. A message's physical appearance conveyed almost as much information as its content, allowing recipients to understand the political implications and urgency level before even reading the actual text. The palace mailroom was essentially an intelligence processing centre where incoming and outgoing messages were sorted, analysed, and distributed according to complex protocols that took into account not just the intended recipients, but the political implications of who received what information when. It was like having a post office where every letter was analysed for national security implications. Oral communication in the palace was equally complex, with different protocols for different types of conversations and different relationships. Casual conversations were rare because most interactions had potential political implications, while formal communications followed elaborate scripts that left little room for spontaneous expression or genuine dialogue. The palace also maintained networks of professional messengers who specialised in carrying sensitive information between different parts of the palace complex or to external destinations. These weren't just delivery people, they were trusted intelligence agents whose loyalty and discretion were essential for maintaining palace security and political stability. Signal systems, using flags, drums, and other visual or auditory cues, allowed for rapid communication across the palace during emergencies or important events. These systems were particularly important during festivals, ceremonial occasions, and security alerts, when traditional message delivery might be too slow or impractical. The translation services required for international communications were sophisticated operations that involved not just linguistic expertise, but cultural knowledge and diplomatic sensitivity. Palace translators had to understand not just different languages, but different political systems, cultural values, and communication styles that could affect international relationships. Written communications were often encoded or written in symbolic language that required specialized knowledge to interpret correctly. This wasn't just about security, it was about maintaining the elaborate cultural and literary traditions that demonstrated imperial sophistication and cultural refinement. Let's delve into the palace justice system, where crime and punishment were elaborate theatrical productions designed to reinforce imperial authority while providing object lessons for anyone who might be considering stepping out of line. Palace punishments were carefully calibrated to match not just the severity of the crime, but the social position of the offender and the political implications of their actions. A servant stealing food might receive corporal punishment, while a court official committing the same crime could face execution, not because the act was different, but because the political implications were more serious. The public nature of many palace punishments served both practical and symbolic purposes. Public beatings, humiliations, and executions weren't just about punishing the offender, they were about demonstrating imperial power and deterring others from similar behaviours. It was like having a justice system where every sentencing was a public relations campaign for law and order. The palace maintained specialised facilities for different types of punishment, from simple holding cells for minor offenders to elaborate execution chambers designed to maximise both the suffering of the condemned and the impact on witnesses. These weren't just practical facilities, They were carefully designed psychological weapons intended to reinforce imperial authority through fear. The trial procedures for palace crimes were often more political theatre than judicial process, with outcomes frequently determined by considerations of palace politics rather than actual guilt or innocence. Evidence was important, but political relationships, family connections, and the need to maintain social stability often carried more weight than facts. The appeals process for palace punishments was theoretically available, but practically limited by the same political considerations that influenced the original trials. Successful appeals usually required powerful advocates and favourable political circumstances, rather than compelling legal arguments or new evidence. Some palace punishments were designed to be educational experiences rather than simple retribution, with offenders required to undergo training, perform community service, or demonstrate reformed behaviour before being restored to their positions. These rehabilitative approaches were reserved for valuable personnel, whose skills were needed despite their transgressions. The psychological impact of the palace punishment system extended far beyond the actual criminals, creating an atmosphere of anxiety and conformity that influenced everyone's behaviour. The constant possibility of punishment for minor infractions made palace life a perpetual exercise in risk management and behavioural self-monitoring. The role of imperial palaces as centres of international diplomacy created unique challenges and opportunities for palace inhabitants, who found themselves at the centre of complex international relationships that could determine the fate of entire nations. Foreign diplomatic missions to imperial palaces were elaborate affairs that required months of preparation and involved virtually everyone in the palace community. These weren't just diplomatic meetings, they were comprehensive cultural exchanges that demonstrated imperial power while providing opportunities for intelligence gathering and political networking. The accommodation of foreign dignitaries required specialized knowledge of different cultural practices, dietary requirements, and political sensitivities. Palace staff had to understand not just Chinese protocol, but the expectations and customs of visiting cultures, creating complex logistical challenges that would test modern event planners. Translation and interpretation services for diplomatic events were critical functions that required not just linguistic expertise, but deep understanding of political implications and cultural nuances. Palace interpreters were essentially diplomatic agents whose work could influence international relationships and determine the success or failure of important negotiations. The gift exchange protocols that accompanied diplomatic visits were elaborate ceremonies with significant political and economic implications. The selection, presentation, and acceptance of gifts conveyed complex messages about political relationships, economic capabilities, and cultural values that could affect international alliances for generations. Palace security during diplomatic visits required extensive coordination between different departments and agencies, with overlapping responsibilities for protecting both imperial family members and foreign guests while maintaining the appearance of gracious hospitality. It was like hosting a dinner party where everyone might be a potential assassin, but you still need to make sure they enjoy the meal. The entertainment programs designed for foreign visitors were carefully planned cultural presentations that showcased imperial magnificence while conveying specific political messages about Chinese power and sophistication. Every performance was a diplomatic statement as well as an artistic presentation. The intelligence-gathering opportunities provided by diplomatic visits were carefully exploited by palace officials who used social interactions, cultural exchanges, and informal conversations to gather information about foreign capabilities, intentions, and weaknesses. Diplomatic receptions were essentially intelligence operations disguised as social events. As we finally reach the end of our extensive journey through the labyrinthine world of imperial Chinese palaces, we're left with a profound understanding of how power, beauty, and human misery can coexist in the same magnificent spaces. These palaces were monuments to human achievement and human folly, places where the highest artistic and cultural accomplishments of civilization were built on foundations of systematic oppression and psychological torture. The people who lived in these palaces, from the emperor himself down to the lowest servants, were all prisoners of a system that promised security and luxury in exchange for freedom, authenticity, and genuine human connection. They lived surrounded by beauty, but deprived of simple pleasures, attended by servants but isolated from friendship, and wielding great power while remaining powerless to change the fundamental nature of their existence. The imperial palace system demonstrates the ultimate futility of seeking happiness through the accumulation of power and material wealth. Despite having access to everything money could buy and control over millions of lives, the inhabitants of these palaces were often profoundly unhappy, constantly anxious, and spiritually empty. Their gilded cages remind us that freedom, authenticity, and genuine human connection are more valuable than all the silk and gold in the world. The legacy of these palace systems continues to influence Chinese culture and politics today, with echoes of imperial hierarchy, protocol, and political dynamics visible in modern Chinese society. The emphasis on face and reputation, the complex relationship between public and private identity, and the sophisticated understanding of political networks and social relationships, all of these elements of contemporary Chinese culture were shaped by centuries of palace experience. Perhaps most importantly, the imperial palace system serves as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of absolute power and the human tendency to create beautiful systems of oppression. These palaces were architectural marvels and cultural treasures, but they were also instruments of control that dehumanized everyone who lived within their walls, from the most powerful emperor to the most humble servant. As you settle into sleep tonight, in your own private space where you can think your own thoughts and make your own choices without fear of political consequences, take a moment to appreciate the simple freedom of being able to live an ordinary life. The magnificent palaces of imperial China may have been among the most beautiful buildings ever constructed, but they were also among the most oppressive environments ever created. The vermilion walls and golden roofs that protected the imperial family from the outside world also imprisoned them within a system that consumed their humanity in exchange for material luxury. The elaborate ceremonies and protocols that demonstrated imperial power also enslaved everyone who participated in them to artificial roles and relationships that prevented genuine human connection. In the end, the imperial palaces of China stand as monuments to both human achievement and human failure, testaments to our species' capacity for creating beauty and our equal capacity for creating suffering. They remind us that true freedom isn't about having access to luxury or wielding power over others, but about being able to live authentically and form genuine relationships with other human beings. Sweet dreams, and remember, in your dreams tonight, you're freer than any emperor who ever lived behind those vermilion walls, because freedom isn't about having everything you want. It's about being able to want what you have without fear, pretense, or the constant weight of political calculation. The most beautiful palace in the world is still just a prison if you can't leave when you want to, and the humblest home becomes a palace when it's filled with genuine love and authentic relationships. Sleep well, knowing that your ordinary freedom is more precious than all the imperial magnificence that ever existed behind those beautiful, terrible walls.